Okay, very warm welcome to all those who have joined us this afternoon or early evening, either in person or online to listen to Velislava Hillman's book presentation, Educational Futures, Governing Datafication and EdTech. Now, following Veli's presentation, there will be a panel discussion with Victoria Headland and Sifu Morrison. I am Anna Traianu. I'm Professor of Education in the Department of Educational Studies at Goldsmiths and the current director of the Center for Identities and Social Justice, which is hosting tonight's event. Some practical issues. We are recording this event. If you do not like to be seen, please turn off your cameras. Only the talk will be recorded, not the conversation afterwards. The recording will be uploaded on the CISJ website. If you do have any questions, and we very much hope you do, please put them in the chat and we'll respond to as many questions as possible within the time available. So that's the housekeeping done. Let's move on to the event. I'm delighted to introduce Veli Hillman. Veli is an associate lecturer at Goldsmiths, a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences, and the founder of Education Data Digital Safeguards, an initiative advocating for greater scrutiny of EdTech and AI systems in education. Her work has a global reach. It is international. She has established collaborations with organizations such as EdTech Impact, Child Fund Australia, and UNESCO. So in her research, Veli critically examines the intersection of technology and education policy. So tonight's seminar, she will explore how digital platforms shape classroom dynamics and teacher-pupil relationships, and the lack of an audit and accountability culture associated with such systems. It is difficult to think of research which is more timely. I'm also delighted to introduce the two panel discussants, Victoria Headland and Sifu Morrison, who both teach on PGC programs at Goldsmiths, among other things, and who have developed an interest and expertise in the ways in which generative AI is currently being used in English classrooms. So I'll hand it over to Veli. Veli will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll let Victoria and Sifu to join the discussion.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, we need to do a bit of a swap. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's great. It's great to be here. It's great to see that folks are joining online. Thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation. It's great. I'm really grateful to the Center for Identities and Social Justice for inviting me. And specifically the work, one of the streams that you're focusing on, the neoliberalism and educational governance, among other pertinent subjects, really aligns well with the topics that I've been discussing and tackling in the book. So by way of introduction, first, I thought it's important just to put some context. My training is somewhat eclectic. I'm trained in international relations, media and communications. I've been in the industry, in the private sector. I've run a media organization. I've worked for the tech sector, Microsoft Golden Partner, looking and I'm selling software for management and analytics, but more on that in a moment. And for the past 10 years plus or so, I've been really deeply invested in education and how digital technologies are impacting learning. I've been very, very interested in actually children's learning, the creation of ideas, articulation of their own ideas, and how technologies are affecting both facilitating but also creating some complexities in these processes. I was thinking a lot about how my book title somewhat needs to be updated at this point and call it Taming AI, because all of a sudden everybody seems to be talking about AI, including EdTech industry itself. And while this shift obviously creates some kind of inconsistencies and highlights some misconceptions, it also points to two particular problems The first one is the rapid pace of AI development and the sense of everybody trying to catch up. And the second one, obviously, putting that sort of race is putting education systems in very tough spot. Because as education philosopher Gerd Biesta reminds us, education is a very slow and a risky process. It's a slow process. And that is in contradiction to the drive for AI development, to catching up with digital technologies notion. So what kind of education do students experience today? It's increasingly digital, focused on efficiency, dashboards, data, performance metrics. We speak of levels and percentages. Emojis are now replacing and representing socio-emotional state of children. We speak of predicted pathways, recommender systems. We have subjects split into widgets. These are certainly the result of policies that have been pushing for years of standardization and accountability, metrics, the groundwork for what is coming today. Because these inevitably, these policies for pushing for standardization, metrics and measurements befit well and exactly what digital technology's very nature is. Digitization of education hasn't happened overnight, and is not the result of just existing, exciting product boom on the market. In the Anglo-American Western context, my area of research and the focus of the book, decades of education reforms have emphasized on accountability, measurement, metrics, standardization as priority because the notion is that education will move forward and somehow become better. And so if we use the same language to discuss education and what the current results of education are, we can really turn to data and see what data says. So let's take a closer look. Well, some of the richest countries in the world today show significant decline in performance in reasoning and problem solving. Some average scores on assessment across different domains seem to be dropping. In the United States, for example, there's a rising reports of cognitive challenges, share of 18-year-old Americans who report issues with regards to concentration and trouble learning new things. While there's plenty to criticize PISA assessments, and there's plenty of decent literature out there. There are great reports by OECD, Organization for Economic Development, Cooperation and Development, and other studies that show some declines and increasing gaps in fundamental subjects, despite the growing rise of educational technologies, the presence of technologies in schools. Reading also seems to be on decline. The percentage of teenagers who read in their leisure time, there are some significant drops. Fewer 13-year-olds, for example, are reading for fun regularly. In 2023, a report is showing that only 14% of youngsters say they read almost every day, down from 27% 10 years ago. In the UK, there has been a significant decline in reading among 8 to 18-year-olds. Surprisingly, some increase has been noticed among 14 to 16-year-olds in 2023, increased to 40%. That said, there's the detail that reading for pleasure, there's also the options include social media and text messages. No judgment there, but it means that the kind of reading that is happening is also changing. Reading basically has declined overall from various reports that we come across. In England, the National Literacy Trust reports that 18% of adults in England aged 16 to 66 are described as having very poor literacy skills. And what does that mean? It's the highlighted text, that some familiar texts are there's a basic understanding of short, straightforward, familiar texts, but there's challenge with longer and unfamiliar texts. That was on the academic side. So there's some data and currently information occupying headlines. in mainstream media in the UK. On the training and job market, this is the transition from education to the world of work. The figures have worsened. So as from this year, we're hearing that almost 1 million young people aged from 16 to 24 are neither in employment, education, or training. All these figures are about members of our society who at some point in the past 10 to 15 years have gone through some kind of education available to them. And much of that time has been a period in which we have also seen growing use and presence of digital technologies integrating. And very importantly, something that seems to be looked sometimes in specialized circles, but there's also data on the technical side of things. And so this may not look like a mainstream topic, but cyber attacks can and does directly affect learning education. Just for a moment, what does that mean, cyber attacks in schools? It means disrupted learning, reduced teaching, often financial loss. It can mean also something very basic, but extremely important to many, many children, like security, safety, protection, childcare, and even meals, access to food. And of course, there's just a benchmark there to have a look at the figures in comparison to businesses, the cyber attacks that primary schools, secondary schools, and further education are experiencing. And of course, all of these figures that I'm describing so far, it's just a pinch. And these are, I don't talk about causality. And these figures obviously need to be looked very carefully. They need to be examined very carefully. There are multitudes of factors that are affecting learning outcomes, learning quality, education quality. In fact, one of the single most decisive factors to learning outcomes is poverty. But these are also figures that we need to look at when we're talking about the digitization of education. And the digitization of education has been promising a lot of things. Equality, inclusivity, personalization, better education for all. EdTech is promising to help expand, supercharge, enable success, empower, engage, and even magic. In fact, magic has been promised for quite a while now. I dug out these examples from New York Times archives. So you can see the promise of AI's magic and computer magic in the 50s and the 60s. Right now, I cannot see well, but yeah, computer cures itself of making mistakes. Computer develops capacity to learn, and so on. So there's a lot of that promise. And so the core of my book, Taming EdTech, addresses some of these issues, the promises, the challenges of digitizing education through, let's call them 3 underlying theses. So the first one is the tech in education, or tech married with education, doesn't automatically mean progress. It's not an automatic upward curve. So the idea that technology will automatically improve education is flawed. And the second is that there's a growing corporate power behind the digitization of education, and our collective focus, stakeholders, educators, policymakers, even parents, students, require focus on mature critical thinking, and even a bit of sensible resistance when we adopt these technologies, and not question them at all. And the third thesis is that education and its institutions have a huge responsibility and role to play in a child's life. So educational technologies and AI as businesses, majority of them are privileged to sell their products and services to schools, and they need to earn this privilege. And so the book, on that note, the book has pushed for and calling for a stricter regulation and oversight of this industry. So I will unpack a little bit more what I mean. So today, education increasingly looks like this. It is platformized and datafied, meaning that nearly every aspect, processes, practices, people, places, is turned into digital data. So learning now takes place within a vast and complex digital ecosystem, much like this image, where you see the digital technologies are increasingly taking the central place in education. And there are countless of apps, platforms, cloud providers, third-party organizations, and so on, who are involved in some way, all gathering and exchanging data for various reasons. So while students and educators use these tools daily, the underlying digital infrastructures are pretty much in the background and invisible to us. And as a result, education is increasingly shaped by these digital infrastructures. Students, educators, and families provide data, and often without full knowledge or control over how it is used at any point in time. This creates an asymmetric knowledge exchange. That means that we, the users, will never know as much as the digital infrastructures, those who own them and those who have privileged access to them. And not only that, but on the left-hand side, we can see these bubbles, other industries and sectors. Advertising is misspelled, but I hope I draw attention to that. It is advertising industry, advertising, but also insurance, banking, loan, even law and enforcement, who may have access and do have access and use to data. So why is this problematic? We have seen in the past how this power imbalance works to the detriment of us, the end users. Platforms like Facebook have shown us time and time again how they misuse users' data to their own benefit and profit. They've used data to target vulnerable teens, for example, with harmful content, influence voter behavior, even people's emotions. There was a famous study in 2014. And in education, there are plenty of examples, which I give in depth in the book. But just one, the Electronic Frontier Foundation had reported how Google tracked students' browsing habits and collecting personal data as they use Google Classroom and Chromebooks without clear consent. And from this infrastructure, which is normalized, there is now an upward drive to advance AI. But whose ambition and to what means and ends remains largely a speculation. Here is how digital and data infrastructure defy boundaries. So I really wanted to get a kind of an example to show that when we say digitizing education is not something within the confines of the walls of an institution, but it spreads everywhere. So there are the educational technologies, any tech systems serving or integrating into an education system are part of a larger socio-technical, political, economic system that shapes education in ways beyond our control. The political economic aspect highlights how EdTech become embedded in broader financial, corporate, and governance structures. And there, companies, investors, policymakers, they can influence education through data ownership and market power. This graphic in particular shows more of a high level, and this certainly is not the end story because businesses are constantly shifting the goalpost and changing things, and the dynamics are incredible. That's the business world, the nature of business. So on this graphic, you see PowerSchool Holdings. It's a large student information system with millions of students and teachers, schools being served. The platform has AI capabilities. It's connected to other various EdTech finance companies through ownership, investment, data sharing relationships. And the different colored lines indicate financial, if they're visible. Indicate financial ties, subsidiary ownership, and industry data connections. This reveals how educational data links to broader markets, including healthcare, financial services, and more. Here's another quick high-level map of Anthropic and their financial and partnership network. So you can see how its AI model, Claude, which is entering universities faster than we can pronounce Anthropic, connects to investors, partners, and other AI-related organizations. Its development is influenced by major tech companies like Amazon, Google, Palantir, which also links to US intelligence and defense agencies. Palantir is also very interested in NHS data. This raises significant concerns about data privacy, surveillance, and AI, and the role of these companies in AI-driven decision-making in education. Education institutions ultimately may unknowingly expose students' information to broader corporate and governmental networks. And lastly, here's another high-level mapping of OpenAI. Surely none of these are complete, as I mentioned. These companies are expanding and changing positions unpredictably and very rapidly. OpenAI's financial and partnership network includes major investors like Microsoft and Oracle, corporate media like News Corp, The Atlantic, and Reddit, and other power players like Apple, Arizona State University, and there's Bain and Company, and more. This suggests collaboration of AI development or data integration or any other things that we as the end users may never know. So what is the big picture for digitizing education? One of the big pictures is, well, that's something I've followed in the book in more detail, but let's try and crunch it here. It stems very much from the Anglo-American neoliberalist take on what education should look like. And it is education institutions basically should be converted into free markets, save themselves. Education systems should be instruments for labor market supply. The vision is that structure now that AI can be integrated and power this dynamic and identify a possible communication between what the labor market may require for education to produce. So we have a sort of education infrastructure at the very foundation, so at the lower end, which comprises components like policy and education governance. These are rules, regulations shaping education, which, as you saw in the previous slides, increasingly are influenced by digital systems and products. There are data interoperability and standards. Here I refer to, well, specifically, American contexts, Australian contexts, and these are standards that enable data to be shared seamlessly across sectors, applications, and so forth, and obviously enable greater computational capabilities. The front-end tools are obviously the apps, platforms, devices that we use every day. And then data and AI is like the middle layer that now has been almost laid out. And that is where influence is exerted over educational decision-making. And that is where we can make this kind of connection with labor markets. So this is where we collect, process, and repurpose possibly data. This is where AI can be trained. And this is where the connection between the education sector and the labor market can be made possible. And the top layer is labor demand and markets within the neoliberalist project. It sits as a priority. This is the layer that represents how economic needs influence education through AI-driven insights. And in turn, these can determine which skills, competencies are prioritized. And basically, there's a seamless communication, or so the vision goes. But there's some bullet points on the side there that you see. So there is, of course, the added value when we digitize education with predominantly commercial products. And again, within the neoliberalist paradigm, this is new markets, schools, children. These are new possible consumers, loyal customers. So we can think of how appetizing and motivating it is to actually integrate these technologies to education, to children as early as possible. And one of the most important things from the industry point of view, of course, is that technologies, AI, is developed, tested, augmented, advanced on taxpayer money. Why? Because it's happening in the classroom. Of course, one has to trace the history that has led to such visions. I do my best to trace that history in the book, standing on the shoulders of giants. And educational policies within the neoliberalist paradigm have been driving this kind of marketization of education. And I draw from authors like Stephen J. Ball, Rizvi and Lingard, Larry Cuban, and Goldsmiths' very own Andrew Wilkins. So these designs are nothing quite innovative. In fact, these models already exist. They are called factories. How AI architects envision them, though, looks more sophisticated and obviously unknown to end users. In these designs, digital systems are basically supplying the insight from the captured data to inform demand and supply, and whatever that might be, today with the promise for greater precision. This is an example of Palantir's Foundry, and what you see is a digital twin. It could be of a factory, of a hospital, or a school. It is literally what Stanford University professor Elwood Cubberley said a century ago. Our schools are, in a sense, factories in which the raw products, children, are to be shared and fashioned into products to meet the various demands of life. The specifications for manufacturing come from the demands of 20th century civilization, and it is the business of the school to build its pupils according to the specifications laid down. So bringing to focus on all of these issues, capabilities, concerns, possibilities, I have aimed to position the book to similar ideas, of course, such as Learning to Save the Future, a beautiful book by Alexander Means, Big Data in Education by Ben Williamson, and Algorithms of Education by Goulson, Seller, and Webb, among others, who invariably pull on individual threads, all of these that I mentioned here at once, from those about the neoliberal market imperatives transforming education to biases embedded in AI systems, and how these can inflict on individuals' life chances, educational outcomes, and futures. However, what I wanted to do is put together what the big picture might look like, which I just shared, because digitizing for efficiency and inclusivity and offloading some of the work to automated systems is not the big picture. Secondly, I also wanted to draw attention with my book mainly towards industry and their level of responsibility and their level of commitment to make sure that we, educators, parents, students, children, can trust them. The bottom lines, digital expansion doesn't inherently mean progress. We should just not think of it that way. And AI dominance has become a political choice, not inevitability. It is a political instrument. As Frank Pasquale said a while ago, warning, the technical arguments that all tasks are reducible to data patterns, reproducible by machines, is in fact a political argument to put AI researchers in charge of the future development of any sector, including education. Another thing is that human experience, thinking about teachers, thinking about socialization of education, human experience must remain central in the classroom, in educational institutions, and decision-making. Technology also should be a tool, but not a mandate. We cannot possibly think that education becomes digital only, digital first. Where's the inclusivity of that? And ultimately, we should slow down perhaps, because like Gerd Biesta says, education is a slow process. Education and child development need thoughtful, intentional care approaches and not rushed reactionary decisions. Education must retain its sovereignty. This is important. Schools and policymakers must critically assess these instruments and the infrastructures that are being built that we are blind to. And the technologies that we adopt need to be scrutinized. Data-driven education carries risks. We need to be honest about this. Some are obvious and some are not. Personalization, automation, predictive analytics can ultimately narrow learning possibilities, opportunities, perpetuate, and even worsen inequalities. And governance and oversight is crucial, like other regulated industries. EdTech must be held accountable through transparency, accountability. Educational institutions know very well from example of the audit culture, ethical standards, and a license in order to operate in schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veli. That was fascinating.
Thanks very much.
Oh. I'd like to pick up on your third point, education and responsibility, and really try and think what that would look like for a child in a class. And I'd like to make the point that much as Google shrinks your search criteria based on your location, as your book says, for a child, using AI can shrink their kind of bubble of possibility. It can, through looking at, I've been looking at bias, gender bias, and if we're using all of these kind of automated systems, it can actually throw up gender bias in science. So you're shrinking the possibility for girls and boys and all people of all genders in what they can learn. And in terms of connected to your point about free markets and consumers, we are further widening the gap between who fits in these certain roles, rather than kind of forming connections across those gaps. And it's incredibly worrying with the formation of like OpenAI with ChatGPT, where they've got the memory function now that will infer and remember who you are and what you like. So a child may be going through their work assigned by a teacher, something like that, and it may make all these assumptions: you're a girl, you're a boy, and then it will change your educational pathways, because it's all about kind of progressive pathways, isn't it, and adaptive pathways, so that what you get, the explanation you get, might be different to somebody else. And that is not allowing freedom of movement, I feel. I don't know what you feel, Sipo, between different areas and different jobs and different careers and different places within society. So I think it's a very, very relevant point what you say about schools have the responsibility in their AI selection, in their LMS selection, the language management system selection, to consider these factors when they are having children interacting, child-facing AI, as well as obviously the teacher management systems as well. For instance, I'm a female teacher. It knows I'm a female teacher. It tells me how to plan a lesson differently than it might tell you how to plan a lesson differently. So that inherent bias filters through systems in many, many ways. And that's not my worry in that aspect. Do you have anything you want to pick up?
I was going to say, I guess that's the implication, another implication of data. Not only is it that we're, because what I was hearing when you were talking there was that data buying and data selling has been around for a long time before this rise of generative AI, ChatGPT and Anthropic and Claude and Google and Google Gemini. Perhaps what you're talking about there is another use of data in the sense of gathering data to then, as you say, focus and influence children's futures.
And if everyone heard it, Victoria was saying about, you were saying about the use of data, that saying that schools, by using ChatGPT, the data that is being given to schools is then being used to influence their educational outcomes.
Yeah, all the data they collect at the same time on their students or the teachers, or the usage. So it shrinks the bubble of possibility for those children and their futures.
Yeah.
Going forwards.
And because there's a inbuilt bias within AI because of what it's been trained on, the information it's been trained on, those biases then are propagated and amplified. That's what you were saying.
Yeah,
and then I was saying,
and
I was saying then that that's another use of data, that it's not just we're paying for, like what you were implying, what I was hearing was that we're paying for our, Google Classroom is free, but actually it's not free because we're paying for it through our data, through their harvesting of data, through them, as you say, the collecting of data, Google collecting our data. And so another use, I was pointing out that's another use of data, another kind of surreptitious use of data that EdTech is using. Would you agree?
I think we're at the point where Theodore Rozek quotes a guy that was written quite a long time ago, Herman Scherer, I believe his name was, who said that if we can view data in and garbage out, we're coming to the point where we're seeing data in and there's gospel out. It's not only about what we're paying with, but the fact that we actually accept the new ontologies, the new truth that is coming out. And ultimately, how I understand it, how I describe it in the book, is that data is just part of information that is already transferred in another context. It is something that is translated for the computers to understand. So that's already one translation. So it becomes like Chinese whispers at some point. So this is context. A child, I can give you examples. I have examples in the book where you have a particular information that's converted into data. So that's already one interpretation. So we've got this new grammar that translates the information, so captures the mood of a child, and that's translated into an emoji. And that becomes the gospel, because if you agree that this is how that child feels, a red or grumpy emoji, then your own decisions, your actions on a daily basis. So this is not even about the problems happening overnight or someone being at risk tomorrow. The problem is with this dripping thing that is happening slowly. So the simmering, the water is not boiling, it's just simmering very, very slowly over the long course. And for a developing child, we need to ask the questions, is this happening? Do we need to wait by the time they're young adults and they have to hit the labor market and they're already fully formed adults? That, wait a minute, what happened there?
Mm-hmm.
The point here I'm trying to make is not to create some moral panics. Absolutely not. We're already well integrated with the technologies, and certainly there's no going back. But to be a bit more critical, to be more tamed, and to tame this kind of gospel that's coming out.
Yeah, this gospel that AI is the expert. I think one of the things that I've noticed using it and helping other people to use generative AI is that you need to be an expert, almost be an expert in the field before you can use it. And that's why I worry with using it with children and using it in schools, in that, well, okay, let me give an example. If I wanted to plan a lesson, I could put into ChatGPT or into Claude or Gemini. I could give it some context of some lessons, and I could give it some examples of lessons, and I could ask it to design a lesson for me. But when it comes back, I need to review that lesson, and I need to be an expert first to review that lesson. If I'm a beginning teacher, maybe I'm going to just accept that as, this is correct. So that to me is the worry, using it as is within the classroom with students in particular and with teachers, that you're using it with people who are definitely not experts. That's the idea, that they're in school, that they're not, you're making them into, you're helping them, you're not making them, they're learning to become experts. So yeah, that's something that I agree with your point about slowing down, and yeah, I really think that thoughtful, intentional approaches is definitely something that needs to happen. And yeah,
it's critical analysis, isn't it? It's building and reflecting and scaffolding how we critically analyze output. We have to look with children and teachers at the output. What kind, because as you say, anything can be thrown out. How can we look at that and see if that reflects kind of the standard we want to represent those children?
The idea that education is a slow process, and because it is a slow process, we will actually need to think carefully about the kind of education we offer to teachers, to student teachers, and the kind of pressures that there are in schools at the moment to adapt to a particular model of teaching, which actually makes use or could make use of AI.